Okay, well, this morning we looked at the issues of personal responsibility versus institutional racism and other aspects of the racial issues in the context of home and family and in politics. Now, this afternoon we're going to look at institutional places such as schools, homes, and prisons. And for this panel and this afternoon, we have a new moderator, someone who is the afternoon moderator, he's the dayside moderator from 10 a.m. to noon on MSNBC. Before NBC, he was anchor at CNN Headline News and CNN Worldwide. He has covered the presidential election of 2008 at CNN. He has a degree from Michigan University and pursuing graduate studies in international security at Stanford. For 25 years, he's been involved in community service in Africa, Asia, and the United States, particularly working with homeless and affordable housing, nonprofits. Please welcome Richard Louie.
Well, thanks for having me. I was watching the entire first half from my hotel room, and I just couldn't leave because it was so engaging. So what a great discussion, two discussions we had this morning. And I hope that after we get past our food comas, I mean, have you all stand up and do a couple jumping jacks so we can keep on moving, but it sounds like, and it looks like everybody still has a lot of energy. So what an esteemed panel we have today to talk about some fantastic issues, things that are very important, obviously, to our country. This is the third panel, as you have seen in your documents there. We will be looking at some of the institutional factors. Charlie started by talking about that this morning. He was talking about the institutional issues that we need to deal with, as well as personal responsibility. So during this segment, we are going to talk about specifically some of the institutional factors. And I'd like to introduce, of course, our esteemed panel. We have Ruslan Ali to my left, the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. All right, thank you for being here. We have Reverend Al Sharpton, President of the National Action Network. Thank you for being here. We also have Janet Murguia, the President of Bennett College. Thank you for being here.
Sorry.
First mistake. I'm really good at this, guys. Really, really good at this. All right. Janet Murguia, President and CEO of the National Council of La Raza. I apologize.
Thank you, sure.
All right. I'll get this right. Dr. Julianne Malveaux, thank you for being here as well. President Bennett College.
Thank you.
You have that aura. Everybody thinks you're from Bennett College, or at least I do.
Well, that's a good thing. We want everybody to be from Bennett College for Women, the oasis where we educate and celebrate women and develop them into 21st century leaders and global thinkers. So you too can be Bennettized if you like.
All right. All right. She is ready with this. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is focus on solutions during this discussion. And please feel free, as we're going through this, to pipe in as you feel as is best for you. And what I've done very briefly is I've laid out some potential solutions to the problem that's been outlined earlier today. These are some solutions that have been out in the space, some that you're absolutely very familiar with. I want to get your ideas and what you think of it. So the first one I'd like to talk about is education. So that was our first topic. We'll do education, and then we will do business, and then we'll talk about school to prison pipeline, that issue that we are so very familiar with. So the first solution I'd like to discuss is the one that I've put up there, and I'm hoping you can see it, is the issue of unions and districts working together. When we talk about how education at this moment is certainly in the middle of a debate. At NBC, we had spent a good amount of time trying to understand some of those realities and some of the issues related to that. So when I start to my left first, and if you could talk about the issue about how the collaboration can work between unions as well as districts and how to refocus some of the discussion.
There has to be a collaboration between all of the adults responsible for transforming the way our schools work. If we don't, we will not meet our goals as a nation. The achievement gap is hobbling young people of color and low-income students across this country. The kinds of collaborations we are seeing already in play, for example, Secretary Arne Duncan and 150 districts where their superintendents, their school board presidents, and their union presidents came together to talk about how to replicate those principles from very progressive contracts that drive student achievement across the country. It is about taking the pockets of success we've seen where unions and administrators and parents and community and policymakers are coming together to do what's right for kids and helping to replicate those and support leaders everywhere trying to do the same thing.
Reverend Al, are unions the problem?
No, I don't think unions are the problem. I think that when National Action Network got involved, we wanted to see accountability. And of late, I've seen some very serious moves in terms of unions on how to deal with that. Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and I just did a tour. And she's even made some very progressive recommendations on how you deal with tenure. And where there must be accountability, you can't have this situation set up where teachers are not judged on their performance. There's no accountability. David Van Rokel of the NEA just spoke at our convention last week. So I think unions are beginning to adjust to a climate that some of those of us that have tried to advocate saying we need to deal with policy. We're not social service, more social change. And I've worked with La Raza on this around the country. We've been able to see a shift, I think, in some of the unions that were inflexible 3 years ago. They're now saying themselves there must be accountability, but it must not be where we have an anti-teacher or a demonizing the teacher. I think sometimes people have used accountability to go to demonization of teachers and union busting. I don't think that's the solution either.
So we've seen examples of that in the news, haven't we, Janet?
No, I think so. And I would agree that the common element that we all aspire to, and I think that's true for the teachers as well as many of us who are advocates for the highest quality in education, is accountability. And I think as long as we are all committed to effective teachers in the classroom and making sure that we have ways to hold them accountable and to engage all the stakeholders and making sure that we're making that happen, I don't believe that it has to be about unions per se. I think we can really tap into everybody's aspiration to have high standards. I do believe that we do need to have common standards in which we can have more uniform.
National standards, what you're saying.
Well, I think yes, because we need to know how are folks being judged. And if you have different measures in different states for different topics, it creates a very, very confusing matrix for folks to really, who want to be engaged, to know how. And so for us, I think it's having a set of common standards, which I know the Secretary Duncan has been committed to, and a lot of other folks, so that we can have that equality. And the last piece I would add is that within those standards and accountability for us in the Latino community, I know for children of color, students of color, it has to be having teachers who have high expectations for those students. Oftentimes, we find that the biggest barrier isn't so much that teachers aren't qualified, because within the margins they are qualified, but when they're in classrooms with students who have the highest needs, a lot of times stereotypes and other types of perspectives seem to cloud the ability for some of these teachers to understand that all students can achieve high standards and have very high aspirations for themselves. And we need teachers to really reinforce that, and then also make sure that the accountability measures are in place.
Dr. Malveaux, what do you think about the issue of tenure, which has also been part of this discussion? And let's also build off what Janet was saying.
Well, I think what Janet is saying is really phenomenal. It's really important for teachers to have high expectations, to challenge young people. When we go back to segregated schools, we can look at examples of teachers who push students to learn, push them to do, push them to achieve. And we have those examples of that. Tenure is not a bad thing, but tenure can be reformed. And I think that there are many in the teachers' unions who are looking at reform of tenure. Here's my problem with the so-called education reform. We're sitting in a city, Washington, D.C., where we have this crazy woman come in here with a broom to say she was going to sweep out all of everything, and now we find that perhaps there was some fraud in the so-called metrics that said that this harsh method of dealing with teachers was, I'm going to fire you if you can't get your kids' grades up. But now we find erasures, we find all kinds of things. Most teachers are good teachers. One of the things that I think we must do, and I say this as a college president who deals with students who come from the inner city K through 12 system. What we must do is look at all of the other factors that shape a young person's life. Everybody can learn, and that's what I think Janet has said. Everybody can learn if we decide and encourage that learning. But at the same time, if somebody comes to school hungry, if somebody comes to school out of a chaotic home, if somebody comes to school where they just had a drive-by, I'm not sure how much learning is going to happen. I don't want teachers to have to be social workers, but I want us to look at the whole picture. And I think that Michelle Rhee, and let's just call names, I think that Michelle Rhee, when she came to Washington, did not want to deal with some of those other issues. I think we have to deal with all of those issues at one time. We don't have an education crisis in America. We have an inner city education crisis. If you go to Alexandria, Virginia, they're not tripping. They've got their children are going to Harvard. Everything is fine. But if you come to inner city Washington, D.C., if you go to Ward 8, which is the poorest ward here in the District of Columbia, you will find challenges that are partially a function of the socioeconomic dynamics that we don't want to deal with. So I want us to look at tenure. I want effective teachers. If you're ineffective, and we can show that there's some folks who are ineffective. If you're ineffective, go away. Do something else. But if you're in a district where, you're in a school where there are so many things that are working against you, let's try to work with some of that. And you know what? I think we can.
Let me ask you this, though. Is tenure, then, does it assist in this goal to bring more diversity in professorships and teachers? What's your view on that?
You know, tenure is a mixed blessing. On one hand, tenure provides people with security of employment, and anyone who wants employment wants security of employment. On the other hand, we really do need to make sure we have effective teachers. One of the things I think we need to do that we've never looked at in K through 12 is sabbaticals. I think there are people who get so burned out. I mean, you have people who have to deal with crazy nonsense daily. And forgive me, I mean, I have an academic way of saying crazy nonsense. Deleterious effects.
I can't even spell that.
But but the point is this: we need to nurture our teachers so that the best of them can continue to be the best of them, and the worst of them can go someplace and do something else. Tenure perhaps does not allow us to do that, but we want to protect the best of them. And so there's an organization in the National Education Association, I think it's called TURN, and I don't know what it stands for, but they really are talking about reform. We want to have the best of both worlds. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're not going to say to someone who's 57 years old, okay, we're going to throw you away because you had a bad year. But we are going to say our kids come first. Our kids come first.
See, I think the proposal that AFT and Weingarten raised deals directly with that. And my understanding is that the proposal is that the teachers would be judged on their performance based on how the students in the classrooms that they are in charge are doing or not doing. It should not be test-driven, which is in itself a problem. And then if the teacher in another year does not make improvement, they're given 30 days and there's a removal. I think that tenure as an absolute is not the answer, but I think the whole thing of booting them out or first come, first serve as an absolute is not the answer. And I think when you have unions raising progressive alternatives, they need to be entertained, and I think that that's what will get us closer to a formula. The other thing is that I absolutely agree that you've got to take into consideration the environment that students are coming from and teachers that can teach in that environment. That's part of being an effective teacher. If you can't deal with the student coming from maybe a home that is not the same as a home with two parents and a peaceful community, you've got to have people that can deal and relate and educate that child. And I don't think that you can have an education system set up where the child has to remedy the environment he comes out of or she comes out of. I think the teacher has to be equipped to deal with that.
And Reverend, that reminds me.
And that's not what Ms. Rhee and others dealt with.
That reminds me, my mother was a teacher for 25 years, and she actually worked in several districts in San Francisco. And one of her last schools was in a very challenging area of San Francisco. But these teachers, to your point, knew how to teach these kids who came from very difficult backgrounds. But the testing, we'll go back to testing, Janet, that did not necessarily reflect how successful they were, because they did have standardized tests across the state of California. So there's some opportunity there, isn't there, to understand those differences?
You know, I'm going to ask you for specifics. Yeah. I'm a native San Franciscan, so
oh, fantastic. Yeah, it was at Star King School.
Okay, I'm Lowell High School.
Where was that at?
It's right there in the area.
I'm going to even get more specific.
Star King School, it is at the top of the hill there in the area of, gosh, I don't know the streets.
Okay.
Yeah, but do you remember the streets?
Yeah, so it's over in Bayview.
It's in Bayview, yeah, close to Bayview. I don't even know exactly where it's at.
Which is one of the poorer areas, and indeed, it's, you know, the challenges have always been the teachers have to love their students, and they have to believe that students can learn. And this is a problem. As I think, you know, Diane Ravitch wrote a really great review yesterday in the Washington Post of a book about Michelle Reed. They call her the bee swallower. She should swallow some more bees. It will all turn out just right. But
Ravitch, how you feel?
Tell me how I really feel?
No, okay. I don't think you're being bashful.
Well, it's not in my DNA.
Yeah.
But Diane Ravitch wrote a really great piece, but one of the things that she talked about is the affinity. There are people who love to teach, and they love kids, and there are people who think that teaching is a job. You have got to see every little child who's in front of you, whether they're dirty or clean or whatever, and say to them, you can learn, because then they can.
All right, Jan, then Assistant Secretary? Okay, go ahead.
Matter hugely, but I want to push you on something you said.
Sure, yeah.
Their scores didn't reflect how successful they were. Our assessments...
That was the argument being made against the school, right?
So our assessments have certainly gotten better and need to get a lot better. With the standards movement, we now have, as Janet mentioned, we have a growing churn in the country so that zip code doesn't get to determine what you learn. That said, we have a long way to go before our standards are implemented in the classroom, before children in one community that are in a class called algebra are actually learning the same that their peers are in a wealthy community. Our assessments guide who's learning what. They tell us that the achievement gaps exist and allow us to focus resources on where students need them the most. Assessments need to get better, sure. And Dr. Malveaux is undoubtedly right that the willingness to teach, the expectations that all children can learn at the highest levels when taught at them, the love for children, huge components in whether a teacher will be successful and whether we'll see progress on those assessments.
So, Assistant Secretary, then how do we hold these up? Because they were successful by a lot of other measures. How do we hold that up? How do we show that to the district?
It's successful. Give me an example of what's a successful measure if kids aren't learning.
No, that they are learning is my question.
And how did we know that if the assessments weren't reflecting it?
The tests themselves were saying that they were not successful. The teachers were saying, we are quite successful. We are getting these kids to school. They're coming to school every day. They're doing their homework. There were certain parameters that they had defined for themselves based on their understanding of that marketplace to say it was successful. So
Richard, the question might be well, what these tests are measuring. I mean, the tests are measuring multiple choice think. Your ability to say A, B, C, all of the above, none of the above, that's not necessarily success. So, you know, this whole race to the top, run to the bottom, using these standardized tests, with all due respect, Ruslan, because I think you guys are on the right track but in the wrong direction. I think that we really need to think about what these tests are measuring. With SATs, for example, with SATs, we know that SATs are a predictor of your first year college success, ceteris paribus. In other words, if everything stays the same. Now, everything is never going to stay the same for a freshman. Nothing is ever going to stay the same for a freshman. So you're measuring something that's almost abstract. Why, you know, if you can look at that test as an evaluation as opposed to an admissions metric, you can say, Richard has a math problem. So we want to intervene right now and make sure that we help him with his math problem so he can do the next thing, as opposed to saying, Richard has a math problem, so we're not going to let him into school. So I really raise questions about the content of these tests, what they measure, and why we use these tests exclusively to measure the success of our young people.
Sure, and I think that that's where this broader set of common standards comes into place. It doesn't just become about teaching to the test anymore. The test is one factor, but it's not the only factor. And one of the things that continues to remain a challenge for many children of color and students of color is that, by and large, you can see the data on this, and it is proven time and time again. But the kids with the highest needs have the least effective teachers in those classrooms. We've got to do something to switch that paradigm, because the more that we allow for only the highest quality teachers to be in the most affluent school districts, we're never going to tackle this problem. So we need to really be thoughtful about how do we see more of that shift occurring so that our kids can have the most effective teachers in place. And
How do we do that?
Well, I'll give you
Pay them more. Pay them more.
It's a combination of factors, and I think people are looking at that. But one of the things that we have in the Latino community that is a particular challenge that I think needs to be addressed as we look at the different factors that school districts are being judged on, and that is 20% of Hispanic kids are in public schools. About half of them are what we call English language learners. They're still sort of transitioning into how to use English language in mainstream classrooms and be able to learn like everyone else. It's important for us to be able to get that right because when you look at the demographics, as we just saw released by the final statistics in the latest census, we know that now the fastest growing part of the population for students and for children under 18 has been Latino kids. And 1 out of every 4 kids now is Hispanic. And so we need to make sure that we're tackling that issue so that those kids can have access to the kind of learning that they're going to need to be successful throughout the rest of their years in that school system. Because if we miss those kids, they're going to be lost in many ways forever. And tackling those issues at the front end, and I would even argue one other piece, is really looking very thoughtfully at early childhood education, because the other statistic that we know is that when kids get into access to Head Start and preschool, their chances for being successful grow exponentially throughout the rest of their years in the school system. So there are ways that we can move the levers that will allow our kids, all of our kids, to have the most success possible. And so it's not just about the test. There are social factors and there are educational factors out there that we ought to be looking at, and it's looking at the whole set of them. It's not just one driver out there.
Assistant Secretary, anything else?
2 things. This notion of needing assessments to get better, it's precisely why when the bipartisan Congress and the President were able to get the ARA money, the recovery dollars, and $100 billion was flooded into America's schools in part to save jobs. $350 million was carved out to build coalitions around developing much better assessments. Pleased to say that today there are 44 states engaged in this process of precisely that, moving away from multiple choice into assessments that actually measure critical thought. Our proposals, Janet's absolutely right, that you have to, this is a pipeline that goes from babies through college and beyond. And our early child care focus, especially as you would have seen in the President's budget proposal, to begin to really move that agenda. This idea of equity, the opportunity gaps. Achievement gaps are not caused by someone's skin color. They're caused because, as Janet said, we give them less of what we know makes the biggest difference, including and especially access to the courses and those high rigor standards and access to effective teachers. But as you said, measuring schools by what their marketplace, right? That is how low expectations play out. A marketplace in a poor community ought not be any different in terms of what we expect from those children than a marketplace in a wealthy community. The last president called it the soft bigotry of low expectations. And I have heard folks across the country say things like, it's not so soft. When they are in schools, wrestling with having to pull students that come to school incredibly challenged up so that they can compete in this new global economy.
But see, I think if you go back and as I said in the beginning, the whole test obsession and just trying to run a test-driven kind of educational system, which doesn't really take into effect all of that with the students. The other part of that is the clear bias if you would, and we've dealt with this with Secretary Duncan, has been low expectations. And when you have teachers that don't expect anything of the students, they communicate that to the students, even non-verbally. So if you are being told that is expected of you and that you're not going to achieve not only academically but in life, that communicates a devastating blow to you. I grew up in a single-parent home in Brooklyn, but I had an expectation from my church, from my mother, that I was going to do and be something. And one of the things I think when we did the education tour with Secretary Duncan, we went to a school in Philadelphia, was the first city. And we went to a school that had been at the bottom of academic achievement, and 3 years later was #1 in the city. And when we talked to the students and were asking the students, not the teachers, not the administrators, not the principal, why are some of you that were here 3 years ago, why do you think the school is doing much better, including you? And they said, well, we were treated differently, there was discipline, we felt people cared and that they expected us to do something. So a lot of it, the students themselves understand what is being communicated to them.
You know,
to your point.
the long run implication of this, which is I think what we need to focus on when we look at where we are economically and internationally, is that we have countries competing with us who are investing in ways that we refuse to invest. We have countries competing with us who believe that their young people can learn. There is no notion that the young people in China, in India, in Eastern Europe, where they're producing more engineers than the United States, they believe that their young people can learn. One of the things that we have to look at, and I know that the morning panels dealt with that, is what the impact of demographic shifts have been on the level of expectations that teachers have for the young people who come into their classrooms. In other words, I believe that we seem to disinvest in education when those in the classroom became blacker and browner. I really believe that when we look at, when I graduated from college in 1974, I had $2,000 worth of student loans. The average student today has $26,000 worth of student loans graduating. Average HBCU grad, $28,000 worth of student loans. Someone was telling me something like, you know, we're going to make sure that you get out of school and that you do well. Someone is telling these young people that you're shackled. And so we really have to look at the messages that have shifted, Richard, because of different demographics.
I'd like to move on to another discussion about teaching. Diverse teachers, which I think you were sort of touching on a little bit earlier, not only the students. How do we attract more diverse teachers?
I think you have to make being a teacher more appealing to a diverse set of Americans. I think that, first of all, I think the level of pay, I think the level of how they are regarded. I remember President Obama, I think in the State of the Union address, started talking about teaching should be something that we make as something as appealing as being a entertainer or whatever. I don't remember his exact examples, but I think that part of it is the appeal. When we talk to a lot of people around the country, you do not hear like you used to years ago, teachers being considered at the level of someone's ambitions that we should. So in order to diversify, I think you've got to appeal more to the diversity of the population of what teaching can mean to them. That's one. Second, I think the impediments of getting there. When you talk about student loans, the president spoke at our convention last week. He talked about how he was paying student loans, he and his wife, almost until they became a best-selling book. So, I mean, how do you tell people, even if you convince them teaching is a noble profession and something to look up to, but you're going to be paying for getting an education to be a teacher until you're 45 or 50 years old?
It's a tough economic argument.
Correct.
The Reverend's absolutely right, and since the president has been in office, the money for Pell Grants for low-income students has almost doubled. the recovery money alone allowed $36 billion to go to access. This has been the biggest investment in access to college since the GI Bill. Now, it is true, the profession today is not as diverse. It does not reflect the student body. In fact, only about 1 in every 50 teachers are African American or Latino male.
Right.
The President and Secretary Duncan have launched a Teach campaign to do just that, help inspire and provide the kind of campaign that's necessary to change the way we think about teachers. On teach.gov, young people can go and find out the requirements to be a teacher in every state of the nation.
Will we have to wait another generation, though, with those investments being made right now that you just discussed, or will we be able to see some? Is there something we can do right now to make that shot in the arm?
You know, we have an education department at Bennett College for Women, and our young women are doing great work in the state of North Carolina and in other states as they finish and graduate. Some of the work that the administration has done has been very helpful in terms of providing additional dollars, and we're very grateful for that. But I think at the same time, there are rigidities. We may have, if we are not aggressive, Richard, I think always the notion of social change moves slowly unless we aggressively intervene. And I would like to see more aggressive intervention, especially in hiring African American males in the K through 6th grades, which I think would make a phenomenal difference, and Latino males in those K through 6th grades, which I think will make a phenomenal difference for young men to see people who look like them, who are educators. I think also with women, it's very important to ensure that these young women have opportunities. We have, I think what the administration has done is what it can do at the bottom, but I think that in terms of NCATE, some of the accrediting organizations in teaching, that we have to do at the top. One of the things that teaching, that districts should be judged on is diversity. They should be judged on diversity just like they're judged on every other metric. People don't want to be judged on diversity. People say they have diversity fatigue. That's like having sunrise fatigue. You know, sun gonna rise, sun gonna fall. No matter what happens, gonna rise, gonna fall. So if you're tired, stay in the bed. You know, diversity fatigue, same thing. Our country is diversifying, and our young people, by 2040, there will be no majority population in our nation. So we need to make sure that our young people who are learning need to have teachers who can hit them where they live.
So there's an idea. Janet, what about charter schools? Is that a place to look at as well?
Well, I certainly believe that we have to have an avenue where charter schools can be an option. And it's just too many of our systems have failed many of our communities, and when the community comes together, says they want to have a chance to do something for their kids, I think we have to give them that opportunity. At NCLR, we sponsor and work with about at least 110 charter schools across the country that are run by many of our affiliates, community-based organizations that are serving Hispanic families every day.
Do they work? Do they break the mold? Do they break that situation where we often see that minorities are starting a year behind and never catch up?
Well, that's what's exciting, I think, on the good side when it comes to charter schools, is that they have a little bit more flexibility to do things that are really speaking to the children directly, to do what they think would be helpful in the incentives, whether it's targeting some of those areas of learning that other teachers and perhaps the public schools have not been supported to do. And we believe that having the training for those teachers in the charter schools that directly allows them to support those kids really is a positive advantage. And in essence, many of our charter schools become those laboratories where we're able to identify what is working uniquely to help Latino students succeed, and then maybe see those taken to scale as we work with the Department of Education and others when the reauthorization of many of these bills come up, because we see what is working and we see the gaps of what isn't
Richard,
working.
We've got 2 more sections. I want to get to
let
it.
me just
Dr. Malveaux.
let me say one little quick thing,
make it
very quick. The data still do not suggest that charter schools are more effective than public schools. While charter schools are innovative, I'm not against them. Let's just look at some of the data. The data do not suggest that they're more effective.
Okay, finally then, I want to talk about this, if this works for me, is the issue of lawmakers and how that some are asking for more, some are asking for less. When we talk about cash and money and interest and energy, what's the right balance, and what should we ask for in terms of our lawmakers to do going forward?
Well, I mean, I think clearly you need equal funding. I think that we need to deal with the question of whether we spend the same, have the same investment in our inner cities as we do because of the property tax setup. But I think that we've also got to deal with the fact that we cannot use privatization schemes to take money away from public education. And I think the danger that we've run into is, and it happened right here in Washington, D.C., is that there was so much energy put into trying to give some young students a way out, voucher systems and others, rather than the commitment that lawmakers have to all. We should be really trying to see how we make the funds that are available and more work for everybody, rather than having some schemes set up on how we're going to have some escape the rest, which by definition is we're writing off the majority of our young people. And I think the jobs of lawmakers are not to select who they think can succeed. To me, the mandate of lawmakers and those that are going to fund education is to give an equal funding and for an equal opportunity for everyone. Because you never know where a child will develop, and who are you and I to select ways that some can escape and we write the others off? And I think those kinds of schemes have polluted the educational environment the last several years.
It's more money spent more wisely. The country is facing a budget crisis, the likes of which most educators in the system have never seen. Very, very tough decisions have to be made, and we likely won't have the kinds of investments that we had with the recovery dollars anytime soon. That said, it is about equality, as the Reverend mentioned. It is also about equity. For students that are coming in behind, they may need more, and we need a civic and political will that acknowledges that. Tied to what Dr. Malveaux said earlier, had we closed the achievement gap as we said we wanted to as a country over 20 years ago, we would have estimates predict anywhere from 315 to 525 higher GDP. Right? So if we are serious about closing the achievement gap, we will see progress across the country. That is in some ways about closing the equity loopholes that exist now, where poor students and students of color get less dollars, and at least bringing it up to equal. But we also might need to go further to help children that are further behind.
I would just add on that piece that, as much as people want to look to Washington and to lawmakers there, what we fundamentally understand about education is that it is a local issue, and it is one felt by communities directly. And I think we need to do a better job of really helping empower our parents and our community stakeholders to hold those local elected officials accountable, because I think that voice can be much more powerful than it's been. We can be a stronger voice of advocacy, and we're talking about holding teachers accountable. We need to hold our local elected officials accountable for how they are making investments, and we as community leaders, parents, can really come together, and we have seen it happen where communities, when the parents are involved, and there are parental involvement programs, parents as partner programs, when they're part of an advocacy movement in that community, they can have the kind of changes for their children that I think we would all like to see across the different communities in this country.
Great discussion on education. I want to move it to the other institutional factor, and that move into business. And one of the statistics that was brought up earlier this morning that you all remember, that I remember specifically, was the earning power disparity. That ratio of black to white, and the income was 62% for blacks, 25% mean net worth. Those were fairly striking statistics that were released this morning. So when we take a look at business, what can business do to kind of bring in inclusion? One of the ideas that might be discussed is what was brought up at the start of our discussion this morning, and that is how diversity is good business. It is good business. And so I want to understand from your perspectives how businesses might bring that message across, and is it an important message to communicate not only to their employees, but also out into their consumer bases?
Well, it's one of the most important things that business can do if they believe that they're part of this society and our community. As I said earlier, by 2040, there will be no majority community. Whites will certainly be the largest group, but they will not be the majority. African American and Latino people and Asian people will really be more of a majority in this country. How do you bring these folks into the workforce? how do you not only bring them into the workforce, but how do you bring the spending power of their constituencies into the workforce? Because we're looking at trillions of dollars that these communities are spending. And so I think that often in the business community, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But you know, that seems to be the attitude, and at the same time, you know that something has to be fixed. Ruslan said something in the previous segment, more money, more wisely. This is not only the case for education, but I think it's the case for business as well. One of the things I think that business must do is to create partnerships with colleges and universities around things like internships and other ways to bring young people into the labor force. They can start as early as the 7th or 8th grade with awareness programs about employment. But certainly by the time I have students who are at Bennett College for Women or other historically black colleges and universities, and you know I got to do my plug, the blacker the college, the sweeter the knowledge.
Keep on going, Dr. Malveaux.
But in any case, you know, we need business to come to us and say, if you're trying to diversify, if you're looking for black women to promote your products, come to Bennett or Spelman or, you know, A&T or someplace else. We need business to embrace our young people and say there are opportunities. You know, it's a hard thing, Richard, to say in a recession, because in a recession, everyone's paranoid. We have 14 million Americans who are unemployed. Half of them have been unemployed for half a year. So to talk about what can you do for young people is almost inherently threatening. At the same time, we know that the labor market is a churn, that even as people leave, people are coming in for new jobs. We can learn from young people. There are so many things they have, but one of the things that they do that we don't is they really value diversity. And let me say one last thing. One of the things that our country has as a comparative advantage among other countries is our diversity. We look at those countries that are kicking us, China, India, Eastern Europe, the euro more widely traded than the dollar. The United States is the only country that really has the kind of diversity, whether we value it or not, we have it.
Yeah, the diversity in the United States certainly is different than all the countries that we're talking about, whether it be China or India on different levels.
So let's lift it up,
certainly
let's
can be
celebrate
leveraged.
it.
Janet,
Yes.
what about, so when we hear this from businesses where they're saying, you know, having a diverse work group as well as understanding that our consumers, our customers are very diverse, and then it has to do with action internally for businesses, right, to break that issue that we're talking about. Because if you're able to break that, then you can bring in those workers that you're talking about. So I'm always interested in understanding what are they doing in terms of activity sets? What are businesses doing in terms of activity sets to show that strategy we just talked about, right? And some of the things they do is they have these BRGs, the business resource groups, right? They have affinity groups. They have all sorts of approaches, advisory councils, diversity councils. Are those effective?
Well, I think they can be, yes. And I know that for us, as you look at the statistics out there, the demographic shifts, and you look at the business community, they do so much data and planning and research when it comes to almost everything that they do, yet with the current landscape, such as it is, reflecting these demographic shifts and growth in many of the communities of color, particularly in the Latino community, there still seems to be a disconnect for most of the major businesses and industries out there in terms of how to engage those communities, whether it's as potential workforce or whether it's potential consumers. And I think there are different best practices out there. One of the ways that we've been engaged with many of the business and industries are some of the corporate board of advisory groups that can exist. I know most recently Comcast and NBC, a sponsor of this event, did put together advisory groups that I think can really be a very good best first step in terms of engaging many of the leadership who represent a lot of the communities across the country on how to really take the steps necessary and look at the different sectors in which they can take those steps. And I think for us, education and how they're involved and engaged in education takes a long-term view. And I think one of the things that business and industry, they're so interested in the return on investment being tomorrow or the next week. We need businesses to take a longer view, a mindset of how are they engaging many of these communities today, knowing that there are tensions among their stakeholders and their shareholders about getting that ROI for tomorrow, but knowing that if they take certain steps in today, that ROI will be there as a multiplier for them in perhaps 3 to 5 years. A lot of times those tensions within industry are in conflict, but I would argue if they're able to take any efforts to look at the longer term view, engage those communities in much more longer term efforts that will, I think, be a benefit, not just for the good corporate social responsibility, but will have a direct benefit to their bottom lines. But they need to look and understand that first and foremost, having those types of arrangements where they're able to engage thought leaders in those communities of colors and who represent communities across the country is a good first step. But then I think it's engaging them, getting those recommendations and understanding and being willing to test out issues. I think, again, in the business community, if they don't see it on paper played out with every I dotted and T crossed, they can't do it. Well, here, we need some people in the business community because time is short. If we're going to take advantage of the incredible need to invest in these young people across the country and think of innovative solutions, well, you can't. You're not going to have all the answers every time you make that investment. Obviously, nobody's saying that you can't have a good idea of what those outcomes and accountability around that, but we need people to be bold, and we need I think the business and community to understand it's going to require a little bit more bolder, and I think they're going to have to get out there a little bit more on the advocacy front. I think, again, investing in programs is good, but we need programs, but ultimately we need changes in policy. And if those leaders in the business community are willing to step up, and I'll give you one example because I think it's very relevant, but recently we've been experiencing in the Latino community a lot of, I think, targeting of discrimination, harassment, racial profiling in the state of Arizona. We saw a law passed there that one of the federal judges ruled in part to be unconstitutional. But there have been efforts by leaders in Arizona to pass even more extreme legislation like repealing the 14th Amendment and others that are on that same level. Well, most recently, there was finally a pushback on those laws and those proposals in the state legislature in Arizona, and it was mostly because the business community said enough. We do not want to be targeted as the state that is anti-Hispanic and that is seen as a discriminatory, and we are not going to support this. And when the business community steps up and is a voice of advocacy, that can be a very powerful force in combination with many of us who are out there also trying to do the right thing. So I would argue that it's multiple layers that the role that business and industry can play. It's about investments, it's about engagement, but ultimately I think it's also being a voice of advocacy because programs and investments in those communities alone won't move the needle as fast as we need it to move in terms of the need to change policies that are going to directly impact not only those communities, but this country and its ability to be competitive in this global economy.
A lot of good points there, Reverend Al. So when we look at these national companies that have these diversity councils, that have these structured, written guidelines that they try to employ and deploy and have done well at it, what about on that local level that Janet's alluded to in those regions around the country? How can they get the support to develop the same programs that may assist in hiring diverse workers?
And let me just say also, it has been the work of African American, Latino, faith-based groups, and I really commend Reverend Sharpton for helping us in Arizona because he saw this not just as a Latino issue, but as an issue of facing all of us as communities of color. So I want to thank you for your advocacy in Arizona. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that, first of all, the way that businesses can engage this is they must be intentional because business operates that way. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out how they do anything else, so why do they need a rocket scientist to tell them how to deal with diversity? They have to intend to do it, and they have to admit that a lot of the omission of doing business with blacks, Latinos, and Asians, and employment, and in how it's structured all the way up to their boards. was intentional exclusion. I mean, when we used to hear the debates about affirmative action and people say, why do we need a program? Because we had a program to exclude people. You have to have a program to counter the program you had. So let's not act like it was just some osmosis that excluded people. It was intentional, and you must intentionally correct what was wrong. That's one. In terms of your question of the advisory board, I mean, we've done a lot of work in National Action Network on this. In fact, I was sitting there trying to count. We involved about 6 companies now. I'm looking at the executive director who's on 2 of them. It's according to how the advisory boards are set up. Are they set up to be window dressings for the companies to say, we talk to everybody?
What have you found?
Or I found both. Or they set up where they actually hear advice and share the information and the data across the board. Employment, procurement, business contracts. Not just come in and say, you know, here's a brochure and we'll buy a table chicken dinner that you have once a year. And I've seen both. So you've got to deal with how the advisory boards are set up and then how you deal with it down to the locales. I think if you're going to deal with the wealth gap and the medium income gap, you've not only got to deal with their personnel, you've got to deal with the growth and promotion in the company and who they contract and do business with. Because we've seen some companies that make improvement on the employment side but do absolutely no contracts in the communities of color. None of their procurements. And the people in charge of those departments, which deals with billions of dollars in some of these national and international corporations, nobody there that makes sure any of that reaches our community. So I think that, yes, it is good business, but I think that they must understand it's good business and intentionally deal with that. And I think that Janet's point about becoming advocates is absolutely right. Those that do it and understand it's good business because it brings in more profit to them, because you have people that know how to deal in those communities better, who are a large percentage of their consumers, who are a large percentage of the people that they're trying to appeal to for the workforce. Those are the ones that can increase their profits. At the end of the day, people go into business for profit. They're not in community work. They're not in charity work. But you make more money if you know how to work better in the marketplace that you already have a large margin of profit in. And in many cases, we are the difference between operating in the black and operating in the red, pun intended. Yet when you operate with the black, you can stay in the black.
And I would argue that, a lot of times we focus legitimately so on the political power that we are trying to grow for our communities. But one of the things that we often take for granted is that we have already much economic power. For the Latino community, it's $1 trillion now. When you combine that with the African American community, Asian Pacific American community, when we come together and we can say, initiatives like what's happening in Arizona are wrong, and we stand up against that. And as a result of that, we're not going to bring our conferences and conventions, or we're not going to bring other major events, and we're going to discourage artists and other people to quit doing the business in a certain state. Well, we can be economic drivers of that kind of reform because we can hold those corporations accountable for their actions if we're willing to use our economic power in addition to our political power.
We've seen
I'm going to let the Assistant Secretary make a comment. Just a second, Dr. Malvo. Do you have a comment on this especially?
I will yield my time to Dr. Malvo.
Okay. All right, there we go. All right.
Well, I do think that we've seen examples of the notion that the communities of color have really made a difference. We've seen saturation in certain markets, and one might look at the foreclosure crisis, the aggressive attack on communities of color, aggressive promoting of let's come and get you all to get mortgages was a function of saturation in majority communities. 75% of whites own their homes. 75%, compared to 50% of African Americans and Latinos. Yes. And so there was a margin of basically ability to try to increase that. We've seen it in many other places. So we can go industry by industry and look at bottom lines. And when we look at those bottom lines, you do see the difference in that economic impact. Several studies have been done that have talked about the economic impact of diversity and the importance of using diversity metrics to talk about production and to talk about productivity. So I think it's really important. Those companies that get it, not only from a domestic perspective, Richard, but also from an international perspective, are companies that are posting profits at a time when others aren't. I don't want to pick anyone out, but McDonald's is a really great example, and I picked them out. I've got a board member from McDonald's, and but yeah, just knowing
No
a little.
bias.
Huh?
No bias, right?
No bias whatsoever, none. But there are other companies that have basically have learned how to go into communities, to learn their culture, to sell their product, to improve their bottom line. We see that time and again, and we see other companies who aren't able to do that. And their inability shackles them and makes it impossible for them to grow. One of the things that I think this conversation has lacked just a little bit is the notion of the global space in terms of diversity. We are flatter than we've ever been in terms of how we sell and who we sell to. And again, I think the leverage that we must have in this country is that we have a diversity that no one else has. But as we see the growth in China, what can we do with our Chinese and Asian American population to leverage that growth in China for the United States? We see a growth in the Spanish-speaking countries. How do we take our Latino population and begin to deal with that? The African continent is so wealthy in so many things. How do we begin to get African Americans involved in that? But we, this country, and I know that Assistant Secretary Ali will support me in this, we speak less languages than anybody else in the world. We don't do language education. And part of our diversity is not just race and gender, but also our ability to be culturally competent, which includes language education, which is something that we really have got to get back to because it's so very important. If we're going to be as competent as others are in basically breaking some of this down.
All right. We're now going to have to move into questions and comments. We had such a great conversation up here, but so many folks, of course, also want to get some of your wisdom here. So any questions or comments? Don't hold back.
Maybe they don't want our wisdom.
All right. You can state your name and where you're from.
Yes. Hi, my name is Juana Hernandez. I'm from California, and I presently work here in Washington, D.C. for an HBCU, actually. And to that end, I wanted to ask what all of our panelists thought about what the emerging role, or I guess the new role of minority-serving institutions should be as we move into the 21st century and are continuously thinking about our global workforce. Because clearly we spent a lot of time talking about what needs to be done on the K through 12 level. We also spent some time talking about what needs to be done in the corporate world, and the missing link between the two is post-secondary education. So if you could speak to that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
I hope you've seen from the President's budget proposals and our work over the last couple of years a renewed investment in minority-serving institutions, nearly $800 million over the next 10 years. They are playing an ever important role, not just in that bridge or in diversity work, as you both have mentioned, but also in teacher preparation. Right, as Dr. Malveaux indicated, schools like Bennett, schools like Jackson, schools throughout the South are really in amazing positions to ensure that we get both a diverse teacher force and a highly skilled one simultaneously. HBCUs have historically been the biggest producers of doctors and engineers and lawyers in the African American community. They play a key role in our history and must in our future. That said, we still see big disparities. The Office for Civil Rights has 6 outstanding desegregation orders between traditionally white institutions and historically black institutions in 6 states. There is a lot of work to do to ensure that the promises of minority-serving institutions, both the promises made in the past are in fact promises kept, but that we provide them with the supports necessary to ensure that all of their graduates can compete as well.
I think we need to combine that with the private sector as well. As she knows, I was involved in some of the conversations with the administration about HBCUs. But last week at our convention, we honored the president of Greater Bethune-Cookman University and got corporations to make a commitment to that college. as an example. I think it should be all around the country that with these advisory boards, that they have these companies that they're sitting on adopt and work with an HBCU because of what they produce for our community. So not only do I think they serve a clear role, and that certainly is something that should not be not only minimized, but highlighted. I think the government on one end has to do more, but I think that's one of the areas, Richard, that the private sector needs to be engaged in on how they can clearly, all of these advisory boards should say, well, which 2 or 3 HBCUs can we make our project? At Bethune-Cookman, they started a initiative which Steve Harvey and I are working with, which is why we attached it there. But you've got that in every HBCU that I've been to. And I'm saying that the problem is they don't get the resources, and they've been able to make lemonade sometimes with no lemons.
You know, I will lift up Bennett College for Women, the oasis where we educate and celebrate women and develop them into 21st century leaders and global thinkers. We have 4 foci at Bennett: entrepreneurship, leadership, global studies, and communications. In my 4 years as president, I have been thrilled to have built 4 buildings, which is unprecedented, the first new construction in 28 years. Entrepreneurship, because all of us will be entrepreneurs at one point in our life, whether we want to be or not. Leadership, because our world is crying out for leaders. Global studies, because we're a global world. We will be an all-passport campus in August of 2011, and I am so excited about that. And it's just, you know, and communications, because it's how we present to the world. You would have to invent historically black colleges if you did not have them. President Obama has said that he wants us to again lead in the production of AA and BA degree holders. We can't do it without historically black colleges and universities. Here's what we know is happening in the age of budget cuts. Public universities have metrics that they have to meet. You can't admit someone without an XX GPA. You can't admit someone without an XX SAT. I can admit them with a 2.0 from high school. They will leave Bennett College with a 3.5 and they will go to Harvard. And that is my commitment to young people. We basically invest deeply, sincerely, phenomenally, and intensely in our young people. And that's what HBCUs do. Other minority-serving institutions and HBCUs do the same thing. But I must tell you, if anybody is watching us, send your daughter to Bennett.
Dr. Malveaux, you're so fun. Jen, do you have anything to add here?
I would just briefly add that, you know, I think it's true. Hispanic-serving institutions, historically black colleges, I think for us, seeing the level of investment in there and targeting those investments in those areas where we know there are gaps, I mean, that's where you have the population that I think is going to be so critical for us to move forward. I would also just make a pitch that community colleges and our investments and strategies around community colleges become really important, because they can be that sort of building, that stepping stone that really can either be the next launch for our students, or they can end there. And we need to make sure that those kids who are trying to do everything they can with the family struggling every way they can to stay in the system, and who do go to that community college can find a way to get on to the next level. And so I think it is about resources. I think obviously we want to make sure that the institutions that are serving predominantly students of color are getting that targeted strategic funding. But for me, I think community colleges become equally important if we're going to save that generation of kids and keep them in the system.
Great question.
The one institution I think we
what's your name and where are you from?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Tyler Lewis from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Welcome.
So the question I have is about sort of the other institution that a lot of kids are interacting with, which is the criminal justice system. The question I have for you is, how do we dismantle the war on drugs in all its forms?
Wow.
You got about 3 days. I mean, I think that you've got to deal with the several layers of that, none of which are easy. But clearly you've got to deal with the criminalization issue. You have to deal with the whole glorification of drugs, the whole appetite issue. And I think that the NAACP just came out with a study that talks about the disparity in prosecutions and the and incarceration. Because even though for example, African Americans are a very small minority of, say, crack users, with the overwhelming majority of the people in jail. So at one level, you've got to deal with even in drug use and drug criminality, we're even not treated equal there. Even crackheads are treated in a discriminatory way. A white crackhead has a better shot than a black crackhead. I mean, that's how bad it is. And I think that you've got to deal with all these layers in a very complex way, but it must be dealt with, because the war on drugs is, to me, the reason it has not worked is we haven't conquered these layers because we really don't want to. There's too many that I think we become the fodder for those that want to privatize jails and have created a prison industrial complex, and I'm not sure we really want to solve the problem.
Yeah, I would just say where we have seen success again is when you're taking community kind of holistic approaches, when parents, schools, communities come together and really try to tackle those issues, whether it's gangs that can lead to some of those behaviors. But I also think when you're looking at the juvenile justice system, we see still so many failures, particularly when it comes to our children of color, and not enough done around prevention. And then certainly, as Dr. Reverend Sharpton has said, is that, you know, even when they get in the system, they're not given the breaks. That we think that if you're going to provide disincentives for that behavior, there are different types of enforcement actions that you can take. And we have found that there's studies that show that it's pretty obvious, but when you mix these young kids with the older kids, you're going to only reinforce that kind of behavior once they're put into juvenile detention centers or to detention centers that aren't meant for juveniles. So there's a lot to look at there, but I think ultimately it's about a mix of resources with the right engagement, taking a holistic approach, using communities, parents, and many of the education system, much of the education system.
Reverend Sharpton has said quite a mouthful when he's talked about the inequality. I think that the whole sentencing disparity is the issue that has to be dealt with. There have been people who've been dealing with it. A crack cocaine user is sentenced far more severely than a powdered cocaine user. Nkechi Taifa, a sister here in Washington, has been doing great work about closing the sentencing disparity. But even within the similar drug use, you find differences. And so some of this is legislative and some of this is a civil rights issue.
I'll just add that the notion that there is a cradle to prison pipeline in this country has become part of the American lexicon, and we have to flip that. It has to very much become about cradle to career. Secretary Duncan and the President and our work in the Department of Education is geared toward trying to do just that, but it can't happen from Washington. It, as my co-panelists have said, it very much is a community, a federal, state, local, and neighborhood partnership that has to take place if we are to ensure that schools are the places children can turn to meet their needs and get their supports, as opposed to what we're seeing today.
Thanks.
Faye Williams, National Chair of the National Congress of Black Women, as well as Board Chair of the Black Leadership Forum. First of all, Reverend Al, I want to thank you for all you do to hold our community out there and let people know that we do have challenges, but we also do good work. We're like the President's campaign team. We do big things. The question I want to ask is, the smaller organizations, the smaller nonprofits, and I assume there are a lot of people who represent them in this room, do wonderful things, but then when they're asked by large corporations to write these massive proposals just to get $1, I'm wondering, and we have to prove that we've done so much. And it seems obvious to us what we're doing, but it's a little bit difficult to put it all on paper sometime. How do we get these corporate heads, or more of them, to come into our community and see what we're doing? And I don't mean the question to be to Reverend Al, but I mean to anyone. How do we get corporations to come in and understand that we may not have all the records on paper that others have, but we're doing great things, and we need some attention, too, in terms of looking at what we're doing and funding it and not having the same requirement that you would of a major company that has all this staff to, write up all these massive proposals.
Well, I'll take it. I mean, I'll take a shot at it. I think that one of the things is that these companies all operate local, and therefore they ought to be involved local. I mean, if you have franchises in local communities, your franchises ought to know who's doing the effective work in the local communities. And I think that some of the national groups ought to be pushing that. Again, these advisory boards you bring up and all, there needs to be, you know, one of the problems, because you're talking about dollars, Ms. Williams, is that they have one thing, and this is the black bundle, this is the Hispanic bundle, this is the Asian bundle, and y'all all fight over that rather than really having a strategy to invest in the communities through nonprofits. Some should be local, some should be national, because you're giving for different reasons. And I think that we've got to get out of this whole thing of where they have us like hamsters running around trying to go on this treadmill on who's going to outrun the other one to get the chicken dinner budget this year, rather than how we effectively push it in. And I think you're absolutely right. The local nonprofits get locked out, who need the work and are doing who need the resources and are doing the work on the ground where they're in business. This is where they are in business, where they need the goodwill and the community that's working and the schools that is working and the after-school program that is working. And I think that we've got to be able to perfect that. Another thing I think is that we need to be able to develop, and I think that's why the Black Leadership Forum was so important. And Gary and others that worked with it. In fact, we just moved into his old office. Is that you've got to have this interconnection so that there can be those that have larger staffs that help to write those proposals and help plug them in, because some of us that may have people that do that on staff need to make them available to the nonprofits, because if we don't have the local nonprofits, we can't generate the kind of grassroots supports we need in some of the national campaigns that we do, because all of us don't have chapters in every village and hamlet. We may have them in a lot of cities, but we don't, and some of them have better ideas. I'll give you an example. A young lady, Mary Hector, who we had at Measure the Movement on Saturday, 13 years old. This young lady organized 1,200 young people in Stone Mountain, Georgia, to fight violence, and literally took it down in their secondary schools in that whole city. I'd never heard of her, but because our Atlanta office knew what she was doing and got it to us, we've been able to help her write some proposals, get some attention. She met Secretary Duncan and doing things. I think that's the kinds of things that we need to do.
Thank you. And I must make a plug for Comcast and say the Comcast staff people are in our community, and they do tend to help smaller organizations.
I would just say I think there are some best practices emerging. As NCLR, we have about 300 community-based organizations that make up our network. We work very closely to engage them with our national partners and stakeholders on different approaches and different programs. And one of the things that we're doing even more is creating coalitions. There's one example of where we've worked with the NAACP when it came to healthcare and healthcare reform. We've worked with Mark Moriel in the Urban League and Capacity, an Asia Pacific American Island organization, when it came to responding to the foreclosure crisis. And we basically made sure that we put together proposals jointly. We've seen that on the Broadband Coalition, where we've been able to engage our affiliates and do joint proposals at the national level, but have had the direct economic benefit for our affiliates at the local community level. And I think more and more of those types of collaboratives are emerging, and I think being part of a coalition can be very beneficial.
Okay, well, Gary and I represent 51 of those organizations, so he's going to speak next.
It's a tag team. I like this.
Good afternoon. Gary Flowers, Executive Director of the Black Leadership Forum. 2 policy questions. 1, should every individual student in the United States have a federal right to an equal and high-quality education, enshrined in the Constitution? And secondly, the United States, among industrial nations, only contributes 9% funding to public education. 91 comes from state, county, local. So in every state, you have a fight between the State Board of Education, county, the local mayor's office. Meanwhile, the children are left out. Is it the position of the administration, or panelists agree, to radically increase the 9% of funding to maybe 50%, so that we can compete with the larger nations around the world who fully fund their public school systems?
So to the first question, whether education is a fundamental right, As the President and the Secretary have said, this is the most important civil rights issue of our generation. Right?
But should it be a constitutional amendment as a right?
Transforming the way our schools work. It is not, though, as the courts have told us, a right embodied within the Constitution, the federal Constitution. There are a number of states that have in their state constitutions or via proposition included the right to an adequate education as part of a right in those states. So it is not. That is a decision for the Congress.
Does the administration support that?
It is not a proposal that I know of that is pending anywhere for which to make a position of support or not. On the question of the dollars spent, you are right. Historically, anywhere from 8 to 10 cents on the dollar is the contribution of federal money. As Janet alluded to earlier, the vast majority of funding comes from states, and there are several state Supreme Court decisions, dozens of them around the country, that have said things like the state system of funding for schools is unconstitutional and turned it to those state legislatures to do something about it. This issue of the appropriate role of the federal government in terms of impacting systems of finance so that they are more equitable is one that we are exploring now. The Secretary has called for and announced an Equity and Excellence Commissions that has many of the names that have been mentioned here today on it to provide recommendations to the federal government on just that, the appropriate role. Now, would we like to see an increase such that we could provide so much more to states? Undoubtedly. And as all of us are feeling in very real time, those are conversations happening in the Congress today.
I certainly.
Gary,
I'm sorry.
Al. Gary, if I could just say a word about the way that we're funding, the fact that education is funded from the property tax is a huge problem in terms of how we end up with educational disparities. If you fund inner city education with depressed inner city property values and suburban education with inflated suburban property values, you end up with something where the GDP, the spending per child, it varies by thousands of dollars. And the federal government could be the equalizer. Now, this is a conversation that predates this administration.
How could the federal government be the equalizer?
Because if the federal government decided to fund more, then the states would be funding less. If the federal government said, this is the floor, and we'll pay for it. If the income tax, as opposed to the property tax, paid for some level of educational spending, then the federal government can be the equalizer. State governments could also be the equalizer, and as you said, states have said the way that we fund education is unconstitutional. But the federal, we cannot afford to have a certain educational standard in Mississippi and another one in New Hampshire. We're trying to be a nation. I mean, what happened to the notion of a nation? The federal government should be doing more for K through 12 education and could, except for the political realities. I'm not, the political realities are what they are, and we're not going to debate those because they just are what they are. The people have denigrated my favorite beverage. They have done many other things. And we just have to live with it for the moment. But the fact is that we've seen these inequities that are a function of how we fund education. I would think, Ruslan, that the Department of Education, among others, would really be leaders. You have so many things on your plate, so it's not a criticism, but leaders in looking at ways that we fund education. I think when we look at other countries, when we look at the ways that we were once first in the production of AA and BA degree holders.
Yep.
Now we're 12th. Yep. Countries that you wouldn't even think of, like Spain. I'm not dissing Spain. I love it there. South Korea, Japan, not surprising, Canada, all outrank us in these things because they spend and fund education differently than we do. So it's just a conversation about how we fund education and what priority education takes in the work that we do.
So we've got maybe 30 seconds each, if we can, before Charlie gets up over here and says,
let me just say, in terms of the constitutional question, I think that is important. I think that for whatever reasons we did not follow up a movement on that. I certainly say, National Action Network is on record supporting it, and it was part of my platform when I ran for president.
Janet?
Sorry. Janet.
Are we wrapping up?
30 seconds, yeah.
Well, for me, I think it's very important to understand that there is a tremendous shift in growth in the demographics in this country. I think it's more important now than ever for us to find ways in which we're investing in these children so that we can not only see those children advance, but knowing that the future of this country relies on the investments that we're making today in those very young people 10, 20 years from now is going to be very important, I think, in terms of guiding us as a country forward.
I hope we can leave with just a sign of hope. The idea of those funding inequities in our proposals for reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, you will see, we hope, great strides to use all of the federal dollars to move a sense of fundamental fairness and ensure dollars get to the kids they were intended to. We have seen great progress over the last couple of years in terms of states both taking the lead to ensure that zip code doesn't decide who learns what, and to close the teacher equity gap and change those laws that were otherwise barring innovation. So I think we have a lot of work to do. But a strong America requires strong schools.
A good discussion, though, of solutions today, though. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Ali. Reverend Sharpton, thank you so much. Janet Murguia, thank you so much, as well as Dr. Malveaux. Thank you very much. A really fantastic time that we had here. Appreciate it.
Nice to see you, Reverend.
And thank you, Richard, for a great job in moderating.